The morning sun cast long shadows across Forward Operating Base Raven when Corporal Danielle Jones looked down at her bandaged hand and realized she'd been wrong about everything. For 18 months, they'd kept her in the communications bunker, told her she was too valuable as a radio operator to risk in the field, too precise, too careful, too important to waste on combat missions. But when the enemy breach alarm shattered the peaceful Tuesday morning and her squad laid pinned down with no way out, Danielle discovered that losing a finger to a sniper's bullet wasn't the end of her fight. It was just the beginning of proving that sometimes the most devastating weapons aren't the ones you're trained to use, but the ones you create when everything else has been taken away. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. The communications bunker at Forward Operating Base Raven hummed with the steady rhythm of encrypted transmissions and cooling fans. Danielle Jones sat at her workstation, her fingers dancing across multiple keyboards as she coordinated supply drops, medical evacuations, and patrol check-ins across the entire sector. The morning sun streamed through the reinforced windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily through air thick with the smell of electronics and strong coffee. At 22, Danielle had already earned a reputation as the most reliable communication specialist in the entire brigade. Her British accent carried clearly through radio static, and soldiers across 3 different outposts had learned to recognize her voice as the calm presence that would guide them safely home. She could manage 16 different communication channels simultaneously, decode complex tactical transmissions in real time, and had never, not once in her 18 months of deployment, lost contact with a unit in the field. But for all her technical brilliance, Danielle had never fired a shot in anger, never felt the weight of combat gear as she moved through hostile territory, never experienced the adrenaline rush of a firefight or the crushing responsibility of making life-or-death decisions under enemy fire. She was the voice in the radio, the guardian angel, watching over others from the safety of her concrete bunker, surrounded by screens and servers instead of sand and bullets. The other soldiers respected her work, but she could see it in their eyes when they returned from missions. They carried something she didn't have, a weight that came from facing the enemy directly. When they gathered in the mess hall to share stories of close calls and heroic actions, Danielle would listen from the periphery, her contributions limited to technical details about communication protocols and equipment specifications. Staff Sergeant Williams, the base communications chief, had made it clear from her first day that her role was non-negotiable. "Jones," he'd told her during orientation, "your value is in that chair, coordinating everything that happens out there. The mission success rate in this sector has improved 40% since you arrived. That's not a coincidence. You keep our people alive by being exactly where you are." She understood the logic. Her skills were rare and valuable. Training a replacement would take months, and there was no guarantee they'd achieve her level of proficiency. But understanding didn't make the exclusion any easier to bear. Every morning she watched the patrol teams gear up for missions she'd planned the communications for, operations she understood better than most of the soldiers actually conducting them. Danielle had grown up in Manchester, the daughter of a telecommunications engineer and a linguistics professor. Her childhood had been filled with radio equipment, language textbooks, and countless hours spent learning to decode signals and understand complex communication systems. When she'd enlisted at 19, she'd dreamed of serving on the front lines, of proving herself in the most challenging environments the military could offer. Instead, she'd become indispensable in a role that kept her safely removed from the action she'd joined the military to experience. Her efficiency ratings were perfect, her technical innovations had improved base operations significantly, and her calm demeanor under pressure had earned praise from officers throughout the command structure. On paper, she was exactly where she belonged. The irony wasn't lost on her that she spent her days coordinating the movements of soldiers who often had half her tactical knowledge and none of her strategic understanding of the broader operational picture. She could predict enemy patterns, identify weak points in their defensive positions, and suggest tactical approaches that could save lives and improve mission success rates. But her insights were filtered through staff meetings and written reports, never tested in the field where they might make the most difference. Her workstation was positioned to overlook the base's main courtyard, and she often found herself watching the patrol teams as they prepared for missions. She knew their standard operating procedures better than they did, had memorized the terrain maps for every sector, and could recite the tactical manual from memory. Yet when mission briefings were conducted, she attended only to coordinate communication protocols, never to contribute strategic input. The disparity between her knowledge and her role had created a persistent ache that she learned to ignore, like a low-grade fever that never quite went away. She was respected for her technical skills, but never consulted for her tactical insights, valued for her reliability, but never trusted with responsibility that extended beyond her radio equipment.
The exclusion from field operations wasn't just professional disappointment for Danielle. It was a daily reminder that her potential was being systematically limited by others' perceptions of her proper role. She'd tried multiple times to request assignment to field communications teams, positions that would allow her to use her skills in direct support of combat operations, while still maintaining her primary function as a communications specialist. Each request had been politely but firmly denied. "We can't risk our primary communications coordinator," became the standard response. "Your current assignment is too critical to modify." The rejection always came with praise for her current performance, making it clear that excellence in her assigned role was actually preventing her from expanding into areas where she believed she could contribute even more significantly. The frustration was compounded by her growing understanding of tactical situations that others seemed to miss. During mission debriefings, she often listened to accounts of communication failures, coordination problems, and tactical decisions that could have been improved with better information flow. She could see solutions clearly, but her suggestions were treated as theoretical insights from someone who lacked real-world experience. Captain Morrison, the operations officer, had been particularly dismissive during a recent briefing when Danielle suggested that patrol routes could be optimized based on communication signal strength patterns she'd identified. "Jones," he'd said with barely concealed condescension, "I appreciate your technical perspective, but tactical planning requires understanding variables that you don't encounter in your current position." The rejection had stung because it revealed the fundamental catch-22 of her situation. She couldn't gain field experience because she was too valuable in her current role, but her suggestions were dismissed because she lacked field experience. Her demonstrated competence had become a prison that prevented her from proving her capabilities in other areas. Late at night, when her official duties were complete, Danielle had begun studying tactical manuals, weapons specifications, and combat procedures with the same intensity she'd once applied to communications protocols. She used her access to mission reports and intelligence briefings to understand enemy tactics, terrain advantages, and the types of situations that typically created problems for field units. Her personal study wasn't officially forbidden, but it wasn't encouraged either. When Sergeant Martinez had discovered her reading advanced tactical planning manuals in the mess hall, his reaction had been a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Planning to transfer to infantry, Jones?" he'd asked, not entirely joking. "Just trying to better understand the context of my work," she had replied, which was technically true but incomplete. The reality was that she was preparing for opportunities that might never come, developing skills that others believed she'd never need, and maintaining readiness for situations that her current assignment was designed to prevent her from encountering. The most painful aspect of her exclusion wasn't the limitation itself, but the casual assumption that she was satisfied with it. In informal conversations, other soldiers would express sympathy about her being stuck in the bunker. But their sympathy carried an undertone of acceptance that this was simply her natural place in the military hierarchy. "At least you don't have to worry about getting shot at," became a common refrain, usually delivered with well-meaning but misguided attempts at comfort. The speakers never seemed to consider that she might actually want to face those risks, that the safety of her assignment might feel more like limitation than protection. Danielle had learned to smile and nod during these conversations, to accept the sympathy gracefully while internally bristling at the assumption that she preferred safety over significance. She'd joined the military to serve in the most challenging environments possible, to test her capabilities under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. Instead, she'd become a highly skilled observer, watching others face the challenges she'd prepared herself to meet. Her technical expertise was valued and utilized, but her potential for broader contribution remained unexplored and unrecognized. The growing gap between her capabilities and her opportunities had created a persistent tension that colored every aspect of her service. She found herself studying the faces of soldiers returning from difficult missions, trying to understand what they'd experienced that she hadn't, what they'd learned that she couldn't access from her position behind the radio. Their quiet confidence, their unspoken understanding of shared hardship, their casual references to situations that tested them beyond their previous limits, all of it remained foreign to her, despite her intimate involvement in coordinating their activities.
While her official duties kept her confined to the communications bunker, Danielle had quietly transformed her off-duty hours into an intensive personal training program that would have impressed the most demanding drill instructors. Every morning at 04:30, before the base stirred to life, she could be found at the makeshift gym that had been constructed from salvaged equipment and donated weights. Her workout routine was methodical and punishing, designed not just for general fitness, but for the specific physical demands of combat operations. She'd studied the fitness requirements for special operations units, analyzing the muscle groups, endurance levels, and coordination skills that separated elite soldiers from standard infantry. Her training regimen incorporated elements from multiple military fitness programs, combined with techniques she'd learned from online courses taught by former Special Forces instructors. What started as a way to pass time had evolved into a comprehensive preparation program for challenges she might never face. The physical training was only part of her secret curriculum. Danielle had used her privileged access to intelligence reports and mission debriefings to conduct what amounted to a private military education. She studied enemy tactics with the intensity of a doctoral candidate, memorizing attack patterns, weapon preferences, and strategic tendencies that had emerged from months of accumulated intelligence data. Her quarters had become an unofficial tactical library. Hidden beneath regulation clothing and personal items, she maintained detailed notebooks filled with terrain analysis, weather pattern studies, and tactical scenarios that she'd constructed based on real mission reports. She'd mapped every approach route to the base, identified defensive weaknesses that others had overlooked, and developed contingency plans for situations that the official emergency protocols didn't address. The weapons training had been the most challenging aspect of her self-education. Official weapons qualification was limited to her assigned sidearm and basic rifle proficiency, but Danielle had convinced the armory sergeant to allow her additional range time under the pretense of improving her marksmanship scores. What he didn't know was that she was teaching herself to field strip and maintain weapon systems that weren't part of her official duties. During quiet periods in the communications bunker, she practiced tactical movements with imaginary equipment, rehearsing reload procedures and malfunction clearances until they became muscle memory. She'd studied ballistics tables, learned to calculate range adjustments for different environmental conditions, and memorized the specifications for every weapon system used by both friendly and enemy forces in their operational area. Her language skills, originally developed for communications work, had expanded to include tactical terminology in multiple languages. She could understand enemy radio intercepts, translate captured documents, and communicate with local interpreters in ways that enhanced operational security. These capabilities had never been formally tested or officially recognized, but she maintained them with the same diligence she applied to her primary duties. The most sophisticated element of her shadow training involved strategic analysis. Danielle had developed a personal intelligence assessment system, tracking patterns in enemy activity that weren't always visible in individual mission reports. She could predict likely attack vectors, identify periods of increased threat activity, and recognize tactical shifts that might indicate changes in enemy leadership or strategy. Her insights were based on comprehensive data analysis that combined communication intercepts, patrol reports, reconnaissance findings, and intelligence briefings into a holistic understanding of the operational environment. She'd identified correlations between seemingly unrelated events, predicted successful mission timing based on historical patterns, and developed tactical recommendations that addressed vulnerabilities others hadn't recognized. None of this knowledge was formally documented or officially shared. Danielle understood that her unauthorized expertise might be viewed as overreach or inappropriate ambition. Instead, she maintained her shadow education as personal preparation, ready for opportunities that might never materialize, but determined to be prepared if they did. The irony was that her unofficial training had made her more tactically knowledgeable than many of the soldiers who were regularly assigned to field operations. She understood the broader strategic context better than most squad leaders, could analyze terrain more effectively than experienced scouts, and had developed shooting skills that exceeded those of several designated marksmen in her unit. Yet this expertise remained hidden, acknowledged by no one, and tested in no real-world situations. Danielle had become an expert in theoretical combat operations, a tactical scholar whose knowledge was comprehensive but unproven. Her preparation was thorough, but her readiness was measured against standards that others assumed she'd never need to meet. The daily routine of maintaining these skills while fulfilling her official duties required careful time management and absolute discretion. She'd learned to compartmentalize her activities, ensuring that her shadow training never interfered with her primary responsibilities, while also making sure that her expanded capabilities remained sharp and ready for potential use. The systematic nature of Danielle's exclusion from field operations became most apparent during the weekly tactical briefings, where her presence was simultaneously essential and marginal. She was required to attend in order to coordinate communication support, but her contributions were strictly limited to technical matters. When strategic discussions began, her input was neither requested nor welcomed. Lieutenant Colonel Harper, the base commander, had established a clear protocol that reinforced these boundaries. Communications personnel will provide technical assessments only, he'd announced during her first briefing. Tactical recommendations will come from officers with appropriate field experience and command authority. The message was unmistakable. Her role was to facilitate others' decisions, never to influence them. The pattern repeated itself across multiple contexts. During mission planning sessions, Danielle would present communication requirements, frequency allocations, and equipment specifications with professional precision. But when discussions turned to tactical approaches, route selection, or threat assessment, her demonstrated knowledge was irrelevant. Her insights were filtered out by organizational assumptions about expertise and authority. Captain Rodriguez had been particularly direct during a planning session for a complex multi-unit operation. When Danielle had quietly suggested that the proposed approach route might expose the teams to unnecessary communication dead zones, Rodriguez had responded with barely concealed irritation. "Jones, I appreciate your concern about radio coverage, but leave the tactical planning to those of us who've actually been in combat." The dismissal stung, not just because it was condescending, but because it was factually incorrect. Rodriguez had been deployed for 6 months and had participated in exactly 12 field operations. Danielle had coordinated communications for over 200 missions, had studied the tactical reports from each one, and had developed insights based on patterns that no individual field operative could observe. But her knowledge was categorized as theoretical, second-hand, insufficient for real decision-making. The assumption that direct combat experience was the only valid foundation for tactical understanding had created a barrier that no amount of demonstrated competence could overcome. Her expertise was acknowledged within the narrow confines of her assigned specialty, but dismissed when applied to broader operational considerations. The social dynamics reinforced the professional exclusion. During informal gatherings, conversation naturally divided along experiential lines. Combat veterans shared stories that created bonds of mutual understanding, while support personnel like Danielle remained observers to experiences they hadn't directly shared. The division wasn't deliberately hostile, but it was absolute. Sergeant Thompson had tried to include her in these conversations, recognizing her obvious interest and extensive knowledge. "Jones probably knows more about our tactics than half the people who've been out there," he'd said during one mess hall discussion. But his support only highlighted her exclusion, marking her as someone who needed special consideration rather than natural inclusion. The comments she overheard were particularly revealing. "She's brilliant with the radio stuff," Private Clark had told a new arrival, "but she's never been in a real firefight. Different skill set entirely." The assessment wasn't meant to be insulting, but it captured the fundamental disconnect between how others viewed her capabilities and how she understood her own potential. More damaging were the assumptions about her preferences and motivations. "Some people are built for combat, others for support roles," Staff Sergeant Williams had explained to a visiting officer. "Jones is perfectly suited for what she does. Not everyone wants to be on the front lines." The certainty in his voice suggested that he'd never considered the possibility that she might want different opportunities. The systematic nature of these assumptions had created a feedback loop that reinforced itself. Because she wasn't assigned to field operations, others assumed she wasn't capable of field operations. Because she wasn't capable of field operations, she couldn't be trusted with tactical input. Because she couldn't provide tactical input, her strategic insights were irrelevant to operational planning. Each mission that proceeded without her involvement strengthened the perception that her involvement wasn't necessary. Each successful operation completed by others confirmed the belief that the current system was working effectively. Her potential contributions remained hypothetical because she was never given opportunities to demonstrate them in practice. The exclusion had become so normalized that even sympathetic colleagues accepted it as natural and appropriate. When she'd mentioned her interest in field communications work to Corporal Martinez, his response had been genuinely puzzled. "Why would you want to give up the best assignment on the base? You've got it made in there." His inability to understand her frustration wasn't malicious, but it illustrated how completely her limitations had been internalized by everyone around her. The idea that someone in her position might want different challenges, might be capable of different contributions, simply didn't register as a realistic possibility. The Tuesday morning that changed everything began with the kind of deceptive calm that experienced soldiers learned to distrust. Danielle arrived at the communications bunker at 0530, an hour before her official shift, to review overnight message traffic and prepare for what promised to be a routine day of coordination duties. The morning briefing had indicated light patrol activity and no significant threat intelligence, the kind of operational tempo that allowed for equipment maintenance and administrative tasks. She was updating communication protocols for the week's supply convoy when the first emergency transmission shattered the morning quiet. Base Control, this is Patrol 7 Alpha. We have enemy contact. Grid reference 3847-2956. Request immediate support. The voice belonged to Sergeant Davies, whose patrol had been conducting a routine security sweep of the eastern perimeter. His usual calm demeanor carried an edge of urgency that made Danielle's blood pressure spike. Within minutes, the bunker had transformed from a quiet workspace into the nerve center of a crisis that was escalating faster than anyone had anticipated. Additional patrol units reported contact with enemy forces at multiple locations, suggesting a coordinated attack rather than the random insurgent activity that had characterized recent weeks. The enemy had apparently been planning this assault for some time, timing it to coincide with a moment when base defenses were configured for routine operations rather than sustained combat. Major Lawson, the duty officer, coordinated the initial response with professional efficiency, but Danielle could see the strain in his movements as reports continued to arrive. Patrol 4 Charlie is pinned down in Sector 8. Patrol 7 Alpha has taken casualties and is requesting immediate medical evacuation. Unknown number of enemy forces moving through the eastern approaches. The situation was developing into the kind of complex, multi-front engagement that tested every aspect of base readiness. As the communications specialist on duty, Danielle found herself at the center of information flow that was becoming increasingly desperate. Radio calls overlapped with urgent requests for ammunition resupply, medical support, and tactical coordination. She managed the communication traffic with automatic precision, but her training in tactical analysis allowed her to see patterns that others were missing in the immediate chaos. The enemy attack wasn't random or opportunistic. The timing, coordination, and target selection indicated advanced intelligence about base operations and defensive postures. They had identified vulnerabilities in the perimeter security and were exploiting them with sophisticated tactical knowledge. More concerning, their communication discipline suggested professional military training rather than the disorganized insurgent activity that characterized most local threats. Major, Danielle called out during a brief lull in radio traffic. The attack pattern suggests they have detailed intelligence about our defensive positions. They're avoiding our strongest points and concentrating pressure where our coverage is thinnest. Her observation was based on comprehensive analysis of the engagement reports, but Lawson was too focused on crisis management to consider broader tactical implications. "Focus on communications coordination, Jones," he responded tersely. "Let me worry about tactical assessment." His dismissal was automatic, a reflex response to her exceeding her assigned role during a crisis when every second counted. But Danielle could see developments that his immediate focus on crisis management was preventing him from recognizing. The situation deteriorated rapidly as enemy forces demonstrated knowledge of base vulnerabilities that should have been classified information. They targeted communication towers with precision that disrupted coordination between defensive positions. They attacked supply points that weren't marked on standard tactical maps. Most ominously, they seemed to anticipate defensive responses before they were implemented. By 0800 hours, the base was effectively under siege, with multiple patrol units pinned down in positions that prevented them from supporting each other or withdrawing to defensive positions. The enemy had achieved tactical surprise and was maintaining pressure that prevented effective counterattack. Standard defensive protocols were proving inadequate against an adversary that had clearly studied base operations in detail. Danielle realized that her comprehensive knowledge of tactical patterns, terrain analysis, and operational procedures might be the key to understanding enemy intentions and identifying effective response strategies. But her insights remained trapped within organizational boundaries that prevented her from contributing to tactical decision-making during the crisis when her knowledge might make the most difference.
The critical moment came at 0847 hours, when Patrol 7 Alpha's situation deteriorated beyond sustainable limits. Sergeant Davies's voice crackled through the radio with barely controlled desperation. "Base Control, we're surrounded and running low on ammunition. Thompson's down with a leg wound, and we can't reach the extraction point.
The enemy has us triangulated from 3 positions. Danielle studied the tactical display, where red icons marked enemy contact points and blue indicators showed friendly positions. The pattern was becoming clear to her in ways that weren't apparent to others, focused on individual crisis points. The enemy wasn't simply attacking random targets. They were systematically isolating patrol units to prevent mutual support while creating conditions for a coordinated assault on the base itself. "Major Lawson," she called out, her voice cutting through the communication chatter. "I can see a way to extract 7 Alpha, but it requires understanding the terrain features that aren't marked on the standard tactical maps." She had studied the area extensively during her off-duty hours, mapping seasonal watercourses, identifying concealed approaches, and noting vegetation patterns that could provide cover for movement. Lawson looked up from his command console, his expression mixing irritation with desperate hope. "What are you talking about, Jones?" The question carried both skepticism about her tactical knowledge and recognition that conventional approaches weren't working. The enemy had demonstrated superior preparation and was outmaneuvering standard defensive responses. "There's a seasonal drainage channel that runs north-south through Sector 8, Danielle explained, pulling up satellite imagery on her secondary monitor. "It's not marked on our tactical maps because it's dry most of the year, but it provides concealed movement corridors that could allow 7 Alpha to break contact and reach a defensible position." She traced the route with her finger, showing how the natural terrain feature connected with other geographical elements she'd identified during her unauthorized terrain analysis. "The channel connects to a rocky outcropping that's marked as impassable on our maps, but it's actually accessible from the eastern approach. 7 Alpha could use it as a temporary defensive position while we coordinate extraction." Captain Morrison, who had arrived to assist with crisis management, shook his head dismissively. "Jones, this isn't the time for theoretical geography lessons. We need practical solutions from people with field experience." His response reflected the same organizational biases that had excluded her from tactical discussions, but the crisis was making those biases potentially lethal. "Sir," Danielle pressed, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system, "I've studied every square meter of this terrain. I know the seasonal patterns, the vegetation cover, the sight lines, and the movement corridors. 7 Alpha is running out of time and conventional extraction routes are compromised." The radio crackled with Davis's increasingly desperate reports. "Base control, we're taking heavy fire from multiple directions. Thompson's bleeding badly and our ammunition is nearly exhausted. We need extraction now or we're not going to make it." The urgency in his voice cut through procedural disputes about appropriate expertise and organizational boundaries. Danielle looked at the tactical display, then at Major Lawson's increasingly desperate expression, and made a decision that would change everything. "Major, give me radio contact with 7 Alpha. I can guide them through a route that the enemy won't anticipate because they're using the same maps we are. My route uses terrain features that aren't documented in standard tactical databases." "You want to provide tactical guidance to a patrol under fire?" Morrison asked, incredulously. "You've never been in combat. You don't understand the pressure they're under or the split-second decisions required in a firefight." His objection was based on reasonable assumptions about the relationship between experience and capability, but those assumptions were preventing consideration of alternative expertise. "I understand terrain, communication, and tactical movement," Danielle replied. 7 Alpha needs someone who can see the situation from a different perspective, someone who studied this area more thoroughly than anyone else on the base. Her confidence was based on months of preparation that no one knew about, knowledge that had been dismissed as irrelevant until this moment when it might be the difference between life and death. Major Lawson stared at her for a long moment, weighing organizational protocol against desperate circumstances. The sound of gunfire from Davies's position crackled through the radio, a reminder that conventional approaches were failing, while soldiers' lives hung in the balance. "Give her the radio," he said finally, his voice tight with the recognition that desperate situations required desperate measures. "Jones, if you're wrong about this, those men are going to die."
The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a physical burden, but she was ready for it in ways that months of secret preparation had made possible.
Even as Major Lawson handed her the radio headset, the skepticism in the command bunker was palpable. Captain Morrison stepped closer, his expression darkening with concern that went beyond tactical disagreement. "Sir, I have to formally object to this decision. Specialist Jones has zero field experience. She's never been under fire, never guided a patrol through hostile territory, and certainly never coordinated a combat extraction." Morrison's voice carried the weight of professional experience and genuine concern for the soldiers whose lives were now depending on Danielle's untested knowledge. Those men out there are facing trained enemy fighters who know the terrain and have demonstrated superior tactical planning. This isn't a training exercise where theoretical knowledge can be tested safely. One mistake, one misunderstood terrain feature, one miscalculated distance, and we lose the entire patrol. Lieutenant Walsh, who had arrived to assist with the crisis coordination, nodded in agreement. "Sir, the standard protocols exist for a reason. We have qualified tactical coordinators who've guided extractions before. Why are we gambling with proven procedures when lives are on the line?" His question reflected reasonable military thinking about the relationship between experience and reliability under pressure. "Because the proven procedures aren't working," Danielle interjected, her voice steady despite the doubt surrounding her. "The enemy has studied our standard tactics and positioned themselves to counter them. 7 Alpha is trapped precisely because they followed conventional extraction protocols that the enemy anticipated." Her analysis was based on patterns she'd observed in the tactical reports, but explaining that would take time they didn't have. Morrison shook his head emphatically. "That's exactly the kind of theoretical analysis that sounds logical but ignores combat realities. The enemy hasn't just studied our tactics, they've studied this terrain for months, possibly years. They know every rock, every tree, every sight line. You're proposing to navigate our people through an area controlled by fighters who spent more time there than you've spent reading maps." The radio crackled with Davies' increasingly desperate situation report. "Base control, they're moving closer to our position. We can hear them coordinating their advance. Whatever you're going to do, it needs to happen now." The urgency in his transmission cut through the procedural debate, but it also amplified the stakes of the decision Lawson was being asked to make. Sergeant Major Collins, the base's senior enlisted advisor, had remained silent during the exchange, but his expression clearly reflected deep reservations about entrusting tactical guidance to someone whose military experience was limited to communication support. "Major, I've seen good soldiers die because someone thought they knew better than established procedures. Those procedures were written in blood, tested in combat, and refined through bitter experience." "I understand the risks," Danielle replied, looking directly at each of the skeptical faces around her. "But I also understand this specific terrain better than anyone else on this base. I've studied every seasonal variation, every sightline, every piece of cover between 7 Alpha's position and safety. The enemy is using our own tactical doctrine against us, but they don't know about the terrain features that aren't in our official maps." Captain Morrison's response was immediate and cutting. "You've studied maps and satellite imagery. That's completely different from understanding how terrain actually affects movement under fire. You don't know how loose rock sounds when someone steps on it, how vegetation moves when someone passes through it, or how distances change when you're carrying a wounded soldier while being shot at." His critique struck at the heart of the skepticism surrounding her proposed guidance. Military experience had taught these officers that theoretical knowledge, no matter how comprehensive, could never fully substitute for practical experience under combat conditions. The gap between understanding terrain intellectually and navigating it while under enemy fire was measured in lives lost and missions failed. Lieutenant Colonel Harper, the base commander, had arrived and was quickly briefed on the situation. His expression grew increasingly grave as he understood the scope of the crisis and the unconventional solution being proposed. "Major Lawson, you're asking me to authorize an untested communications specialist to provide tactical guidance to a patrol under fire? The potential for catastrophic failure is enormous."
"Sir," Danielle said, addressing Harper directly, 7 Alpha is going to die if we continue with conventional approaches. The enemy has demonstrated superior preparation and is systematically defeating our standard tactics. My route uses terrain features that exist outside their planning because those features aren't documented in standard military databases. Harper studied her with the calculating gaze of an officer who'd spent decades making decisions where lives hung on the balance. Specialist Jones, if your guidance results in additional casualties, if your theoretical knowledge proves inadequate under combat conditions, if your route leads our people into a trap, you'll bear the responsibility for those deaths. Are you prepared for that weight? The question was designed to test her resolve, to force her to confront the possibility that her confidence might be misplaced and her knowledge insufficient. Around her, experienced officers waited for her response, each of them knowing the crushing burden of responsibility for decisions made under pressure when perfect information wasn't available. Danielle looked at the tactical display showing 7 Alpha's deteriorating position, listened to the sound of gunfire transmitting through Davy's radio, and felt the weight of months of preparation converging on this single moment. "Sir, I'm more prepared to bear that responsibility than I am to watch those soldiers die while I remain silent about knowledge that might save them." Her response revealed the fundamental difference between her perspective and that of the experienced officers around her. They saw untested theoretical knowledge as a dangerous gamble. She saw proven tactical procedures as inadequate responses to an enemy that had studied and countered conventional approaches. The debate had reached an impasse where time was running out and decisions had to be made.
The command bunker fell into tense silence as Lieutenant Colonel Harper weighed the impossible choice before him. Through the radio static, Davis's voice provided a grim countdown to catastrophe. "Base control, estimate 10 minutes before our position is overrun. Thompson's lost a lot of blood, and we're down to our last magazines." The mechanical precision of his report couldn't hide the desperation of a professional soldier watching his options disappear. Harper's decades of command experience had prepared him for difficult decisions, but this situation defied conventional military logic. Every principle of sound leadership argued against entrusting tactical guidance to an untested communications specialist whose knowledge was entirely theoretical. Yet every conventional approach had failed, and time was eliminating alternatives faster than new options could be developed. "Major Lawson," Harper said finally, his voice carrying the weight of command authority. "I cannot officially authorize this action. The risk to the patrol and the potential for catastrophic failure make it impossible to approve through normal command channels." His words seemed to close the door on Danielle's proposal, but his tone suggested that the conversation wasn't over. Danielle felt her heart sink as the familiar pattern of exclusion repeated itself at the moment when her knowledge might matter most. Around her, the experienced officers nodded with what appeared to be relief that sound military judgment had prevailed over desperate improvisation. The crisis would be handled through established procedures, even if those procedures had already proven inadequate. But Harper wasn't finished. "However," he continued, looking directly at Danielle, "if a communications specialist were to exceed her authority during a crisis and attempt to provide unauthorized guidance to a patrol in extremis, and if that guidance were to prove successful, the chain of command might find such initiative deserving of recognition rather than punishment." The carefully worded statement provided official cover while creating unofficial permission. Harper was offering her the opportunity to act while protecting himself and the command structure from responsibility for authorizing unconventional tactics. The decision was being placed entirely on her shoulders, along with all consequences that might follow. Morrison immediately understood the implications. "Sir, you're asking her to violate direct orders and exceed her authority without official approval. If this goes wrong, she'll face court-martial for insubordination while we claim ignorance of her actions." His objection reflected genuine concern for Danielle's career and future,
but it also revealed his continued skepticism about her capabilities. "I am not asking anyone to do anything," Harper replied carefully. "I'm simply observing that crisis situations sometimes require individual initiative that exceeds normal authority limitations. History judges such initiatives by their results, not by their adherence to procedural guidelines." His response was a masterclass in military diplomacy, providing guidance without giving orders, suggesting action without accepting responsibility. Danielle understood that she was being offered exactly what she'd always wanted, an opportunity to prove her capabilities in a situation where her knowledge could make a decisive difference. But the opportunity came with total personal risk and no institutional support. Success would be attributed to her initiative. Failure would be attributed to her insubordination. The radio crackled with renewed urgency from 7 Alpha's position. "Base control, they're moving to within 100 meters of our position. We can see them maneuvering for a final assault. This is probably our last transmission." Davis's voice remained professionally calm, but the finality in his tone indicated that conventional extraction options had been exhausted. Major Lawson looked at Danielle with an expression that mixed hope with resignation. "Jones, whatever you decide to do, you need to decide now. Those men don't have time for extended deliberation." His statement was another carefully neutral position that avoided direct authorization while acknowledging the urgency of the situation. Danielle picked up the radio handset and felt the weight of everything she'd prepared for during months of secret training and study. This was the moment when theoretical knowledge would be tested against life-and-death reality, when her hidden expertise would either prove sufficient or catastrophically inadequate. She was about to discover whether her comprehensive preparation could bridge the gap between academic understanding and combat effectiveness. 7 Alpha, this is base control. I'm going to guide you through an extraction route that's not on your maps. You'll need to trust my directions completely and move exactly as I instruct." She had just crossed a line that separated authorized communications support from unauthorized tactical guidance. Around her, the command staff watched with expressions ranging from hopeful anticipation to barely concealed horror. Harper had created the conditions for her to act, but he'd also ensured that the consequences would be entirely hers to bear. She was operating without backup, without official support, and without the safety net of established procedures. Davis's response came immediately. "Base control, we'll follow any guidance you can provide. Our current position is untenable, and we're out of alternatives." His willingness to trust her directions reflected the desperation of their situation, but it also placed absolute responsibility for their survival on her untested knowledge and unproven tactical judgment.
7 Alpha, listen carefully, Danielle began, pulling up her detailed terrain maps while monitoring multiple communication channels simultaneously. "You're going to move in a direction that seems counterintuitive, but I need you to trust the route I'm providing. First, I need your exact position relative to the large boulder formation on your eastern side." Davies's response came through static and the distant sound of gunfire. "Base control, the boulder formation is approximately 30 meters to our east. We're in a shallow depression with Thompson, who's conscious but needs immediate medical attention. Enemy positions appeared to be north, west, and south of our location." Danielle consulted her hand-drawn terrain analysis, overlaying seasonal water flow patterns with vegetation coverage data she'd compiled during countless off-duty hours. 7 Alpha, the enemy has positioned themselves using the same tactical maps we use, which means they don't know about a seasonal drainage channel that runs beneath the surface vegetation. You're going to use that channel to break contact." She could hear skeptical murmurs from the officers around her, but Harper's earlier statement had created a protective bubble that prevented direct interference. Major Lawson monitored her communications while simultaneously coordinating other elements of the base defense, trusting her to guide 7 Alpha while managing broader tactical requirements. 7 Alpha, move directly toward the boulder formation but stop 10 meters before you reach it. Look for a line of darker vegetation that runs north-south. That vegetation marks a seasonal drainage channel that's currently dry but provides concealed movement.
Her instructions were based on satellite imagery analysis combined with topographical data that revealed features invisible to standard military mapping. Davis's response carried obvious concern. Base Control, moving toward the boulder formation takes us closer to enemy positions. Are you certain about this route? His question reflected the natural reluctance of soldiers under fire to move in directions that seemed tactically unsound. 7 Alpha, I understand your concern, but the enemy has positioned themselves to control the obvious escape routes. This drainage channel provides concealment that's not visible from their positions. They're expecting you to move away from the boulder formation, not toward it. Danielle's confidence was based on comprehensive terrain analysis, but she understood that her knowledge was being tested against combat reality. As Davies began moving his patrol according to her directions, Danielle monitored their progress through radio communications while simultaneously tracking enemy activity through intercepted transmissions. Her language skills allowed her to understand enemy coordination efforts, providing real-time intelligence about their movements and intentions. Base Control, we've located the vegetation line you described. It's definitely different from the surrounding area, and there appears to be a depression beneath it. How deep is this channel, and how far does it extend? His questions revealed professional assessment of the route she identified, evaluating its tactical utility under current circumstances. Danielle consulted her detailed analysis of seasonal water flow patterns and erosion data. 7 Alpha, the channel varies in depth from 1 to 3 meters and extends approximately 400 meters in a north-south direction. You'll follow it north for 200 meters, then transition to a rocky outcropping that provides elevated defensive positions. The extraction route she'd planned required 7 Alpha to move through terrain that appeared exposed on standard maps but was actually concealed by natural features that weren't documented in official databases. Her months of study had revealed the gap between cartographic representation and actual terrain characteristics. Captain Morrison, monitoring the communication from across the bunker, shook his head with obvious disapproval. She's asking them to move through what appears to be open ground while carrying a wounded soldier. If her terrain analysis is wrong, they'll be completely exposed to enemy fire. His concern reflected standard tactical thinking about movement under fire. But Danielle's analysis had identified concealment that existed below the visible surface level. The seasonal drainage channel provided a natural trench system that would allow movement while remaining invisible to enemy observation posts. Her understanding of the terrain's three-dimensional characteristics exceeded what was available through conventional mapping resources. 7 Alpha, begin movement along the channel. Maintain noise discipline and watch for my guidance about transition points. The enemy will lose visual contact once you're in the channel, but they may attempt to reposition when they realize you've disappeared. Her instructions reflected understanding of both terrain advantages and likely enemy responses. As Davies guided his patrol into the drainage channel, Danielle felt the weight of absolute responsibility for their survival. Her theoretical knowledge was being tested against life-and-death reality, with no backup plan if her analysis proved incorrect. The months of secret preparation had led to this moment when her hidden expertise would either prove sufficient or catastrophically inadequate. Through the radio, she could hear the sounds of movement as 7 Alpha navigated the route she'd provided. Their progress confirmed her terrain analysis, but the real test would come when they attempted to transition from concealed movement to defensible positions while avoiding enemy forces that were actively searching for them. The first indication that Danielle's route was working came when enemy radio chatter shifted from confident coordination to confused searches. Through her headset, she monitored intercepted transmissions as enemy units reported losing contact with 7 Alpha's position. "They've disappeared," came one transmission she translated in real time, no movement visible from any observation posts. But the enemy's confusion quickly transformed into systematic hunting as they recognized that their prey had escaped the trap. Danielle listened to their communications with growing concern as enemy commanders began repositioning units to search likely escape routes. They were adapting to the unexpected situation with professional competence that made 7 Alpha's extraction far from certain. 7 Alpha, she transmitted, enemy forces are repositioning to search for you. You need to accelerate your movement through the channel. In approximately 50 meters, you'll reach a junction where a smaller channel branches to the east. Take that branch, not the main channel. Her instructions were based on detailed terrain analysis, but the pressure of enemy adaptation was compressing the time available for careful movement.
Davies's response carried the strain of moving through difficult terrain while carrying a wounded soldier under time pressure. Base control. The smaller channel is barely wide enough for single-file movement, and Thompson's condition is deteriorating. Can we continue on the main channel? His question reflected the practical challenges of implementing her route under combat conditions. Negative 7 Alpha. The main channel becomes shallow 50 meters ahead and provides insufficient concealment. The enemy will position watchers along the main route within the next few minutes. The eastern branch leads to rocky terrain that offers both concealment and defensive positions. Danielle's response was based on predicting enemy tactical thinking combined with detailed knowledge of terrain variations. Around her in the command bunker, tension was mounting as other elements of the base defense faced increasing pressure. Major Lawson coordinated responses to multiple contact points while monitoring 7 Alpha's extraction, his attention divided between immediate tactical requirements and the unprecedented situation of communications specialist-guided tactical movement. Base control, Davies transmitted with obvious strain. We're in the eastern branch, but the terrain is more difficult than anticipated. Thompson's losing consciousness and we're moving slower than planned. Do you have updated information about enemy positions? His report revealed the gap between theoretical route planning and practical implementation under combat stress. Danielle consulted her communication intercepts while calculating movement timing based on terrain difficulty. 7 Alpha, enemy search teams are approximately 8 minutes behind your current position, but they're following the main channel. Continue east for another 100 meters, then look for a natural rock formation that provides climbing access to higher ground. The critical moment arrived when 7 Alpha reached the transition point between concealed movement and exposed climbing. The rocky outcropping that Danielle had identified from satellite imagery was exactly where her analysis had predicted, but ascending it while carrying a wounded soldier would require precise timing to avoid enemy observation. 7 Alpha, you have a 4-minute window before enemy patrols reach positions where they can observe the rock formation. Begin your ascent immediately. There's a concealed route on the eastern face that's not visible from the valley floor. Her instructions required absolute trust in her terrain analysis, since any miscalculation would expose the patrol to enemy fire at their most vulnerable moment. Davies began the ascent with professional determination, but his radio communications revealed the extreme difficulty of the maneuver. Base control, this climb is technically challenging even without carrying Thompson. We're going to need more time than 4 minutes. His assessment threatened to collapse the carefully calculated timing that Danielle's extraction plan required. Enemy radio intercepts confirmed her worst fears. Search teams were moving faster than anticipated and were beginning to expand their search pattern beyond the main drainage channel. Check all side channels. They couldn't have disappeared completely. Prepare to investigate the eastern terrain features. Danielle realized that her extraction plan was about to fail, not because of terrain analysis errors, but because of timing miscalculations under combat pressure. 7 Alpha would be caught in the most vulnerable part of their movement, exposed on the rock face with no concealment and no escape route. Her theoretical knowledge had proven accurate, but her understanding of implementation challenges had been insufficient. 7 Alpha, she transmitted with growing desperation. Enemy forces are moving faster than anticipated. You have less than 2 minutes before they reach observation positions. Is there any way to accelerate your movement? Her question reflected the cruel reality that perfect terrain knowledge couldn't overcome the physical limitations of moving a wounded soldier through difficult terrain under time pressure. The response came not from Davies, but from Private Mitchell, whose voice carried the strain of someone pushing beyond normal physical limits. Base control, we're moving as fast as possible, but Thompson's a deadweight and this rock face is nearly vertical. We need more time or a different route. His assessment confirmed that Danielle's extraction plan was failing at the critical transition point. Around her in the command bunker, the skeptical expressions of experienced officers reflected their understanding that theoretical knowledge had reached its limitations. Captain Morrison's earlier warnings about the gap between map study and combat reality were being validated as 7 Alpha faced a situation that careful planning couldn't resolve. Danielle stared at her terrain maps, searching desperately for alternatives that didn't exist. Her months of preparation had brought 7 Alpha to within sight of safety, but the final obstacle was proving insurmountable under the pressure of enemy pursuit and wounded soldier logistics. The critical test of her knowledge was revealing both its strengths and its fatal limitations.
In the moment when conventional solutions had been exhausted and 7 Alpha faced imminent capture, Danielle's mind shifted from tactical planning to desperate improvisation. She suddenly remembered a detail from her unauthorized terrain studies that hadn't seemed relevant to extraction planning: a series of artificial tunnels created by a mining operation that had been abandoned decades before the military established the base. 7 Alpha, she transmitted with renewed urgency. Stop your ascent. There's an alternative I didn't mention because it's not on any official maps. Look for a horizontal crack in the rock face, approximately 2 meters above your current position. It's not a natural formation. Her instruction was based on historical research she had conducted into the area's mining history, information that had seemed academically interesting but tactically irrelevant until this moment. Davies's response carried exhaustion and skepticism. Base control, we can see what looks like a crack, but it appears too small for human passage. Are you certain about this route? His question reflected the natural reluctance of soldiers under pressure to trust guidance that seemed to defy visual evidence. 7 Alpha, the crack is the entrance to a mining tunnel that extends horizontally through the rock formation. The opening is concealed by natural overgrowth, but it's wide enough for single-file movement. The tunnel exits on the opposite side of the formation, where you'll have clear sightlines to base defensive positions. Danielle's instructions were based on mining survey documents she had discovered in the base's historical archives during her off-duty research. The enemy radio intercepts confirmed that search teams were approaching the base of the rock formation. Through her headset, she could hear enemy commanders coordinating the search pattern that would soon expose 7 Alpha's position. Cover all approaches to the eastern rocks. They cannot climb that formation quickly enough to escape observation. Base control, we found the tunnel entrance. It's exactly where you indicated, but Thompson is unconscious and the passage appears very narrow. How long is this tunnel and what's the condition inside? His questions reflected professional assessment of a route that appeared both promising and potentially dangerous. Danielle consulted the mining documents she had memorized months earlier. 7 Alpha, the tunnel extends approximately 60 meters through solid rock. It's artificially reinforced and should be structurally sound. The exit provides concealed observation of the entire valley and connects to established defensive positions. Her confidence was based on engineering reports that had described the tunnel as a permanent installation designed for long-term use. As Davies began moving his patrol into the tunnel, enemy forces reached the base of the rock formation and began their systematic search of climbing routes. Through intercepted communications, Danielle could hear their confusion as they found evidence of 7 Alpha's presence, but no indication of continued movement. The patrol had effectively vanished from an area that appeared to offer no concealment. Base control, came Davies's transmission from inside the tunnel. This passage is in better condition than expected. Thompson is regaining consciousness and we can see light from the far end. Estimate 5 minutes to exit point. His report indicated that Danielle's unconventional route was proving tactically sound, despite its absence from official maps. The enemy search teams continued their methodical examination of the rock formation, unaware that their quarry was moving through the mountain itself. Danielle monitored their communications while tracking 7 Alpha's progress, realizing that her comprehensive preparation had included information that no conventional tactical planning would have considered relevant. Major Lawson, who had been monitoring the extraction with obvious tension, looked at Danielle with an expression that mixed relief with amazement. "Jones, how did you know about mining tunnels that aren't documented in our tactical databases?" Her response reflected the broader command staff's growing recognition that her knowledge extended beyond standard communications training. "Sir, I researched the historical background of our operational area during off-duty hours. The mining surveys were in the base's archives, filed under historical documents rather than tactical intelligence." Her response revealed the depth of preparation that had seemed excessive to others, but was now proving tactically decisive. 7 Alpha, you should be approaching the tunnel exit. Exercise extreme caution when emerging and be prepared to signal base defensive positions for covering fire if necessary. Danielle's guidance reflected understanding that successful extraction required coordination with base defenses, not just escape from immediate danger.
Davies's final transmission from the tunnel carried the relief of a professional soldier who had survived over overwhelming odds. Base control. We can see the exit clearly. Thompson is conscious and mobile with assistance. Request coordination with base defenses for final movement to friendly positions. His report indicated that 7 Alpha had successfully navigated the route that conventional wisdom would have declared impossible. As 7 Alpha emerged from the tunnel into sight of base defensive positions, Danielle realized that her months of unauthorized preparation had achieved something that standard tactical procedures could not. Her comprehensive knowledge, dismissed by others as inappropriate curiosity, had provided the key to survival when conventional approaches failed. The successful extraction represented more than tactical victory. It demonstrated that expertise could develop through unconventional preparation, and that institutional assumptions about appropriate knowledge might limit rather than enhance operational effectiveness. 7 Alpha was alive because someone had prepared for possibilities that others hadn't considered relevant to her assigned duties.
6 months after the morning that changed everything, Corporal Danielle Jones stood in the same command bunker, but her role had been transformed beyond recognition. The communications equipment remained the same, but her workstation now included tactical planning materials, intelligence analysis resources, and direct communication links to field operations that reflected her new position as the base's tactical intelligence coordinator. The morning briefing that had once excluded her tactical input now began with her comprehensive threat assessment and operational recommendations. Lieutenant Colonel Harper, who had initially resisted her unauthorized guidance, now relied on her analysis for strategic planning decisions that affected the entire sector's operational effectiveness. "Jones," Harper announced to the assembled staff, "your terrain analysis has identified 3 potential infiltration routes that enemy forces might use for coordinated attacks similar to the one we faced 6 months ago. What are your recommendations for defensive modifications?" His question reflected the complete reversal in how her expertise was valued and utilized. Her response demonstrated capabilities that had been hidden for 18 months of deployment. "Sir, the seasonal changes have created new concealment opportunities that enemy forces will likely exploit during the next operational cycle. I recommend repositioning observation posts to cover dead ground that becomes accessible during the dry season, and establishing communication relays that maintain contact with patrol units in areas where our current coverage is inadequate." Captain Morrison, who had once dismissed her tactical insights, now served as her liaison for implementing intelligence recommendations in field operations. "Jones, your analysis of enemy communication patterns has proven accurate in predicting attack timing for the past 4 months. Do you see indicators suggesting increased threat activity in the coming weeks?" The transformation in organizational attitudes toward her capabilities reflected broader changes in how the base approached tactical intelligence and operational planning. Her success in guiding 7 Alpha's extraction had catalyzed recognition that expertise could develop through unconventional preparation, and that institutional assumptions about appropriate knowledge might limit operational effectiveness. But the most significant change was in how other soldiers approached their own professional development. Inspired by her example, multiple personnel had begun expanding their knowledge beyond assigned specialties, conducting independent research into areas that might enhance their contributions to mission success. Sergeant Martinez had completed advanced medical training that enabled him to provide trauma care beyond basic first aid requirements. Private Thompson, fully recovered from his injuries, had developed expertise in explosive ordnance disposal that complemented his infantry qualifications. Even Captain Morrison had begun studying historical analysis methods that enhanced his understanding of operational patterns. "The example you set has created a culture of expanded preparation throughout our unit," Harper observed during her performance review. "Personnel are taking initiative to develop capabilities that exceed their assigned duties, and our operational effectiveness has improved significantly as a result." The ripple effects extended beyond individual professional development to organizational approaches to tactical planning and intelligence analysis. Her success had demonstrated that valuable insights could emerge from sources that traditional military hierarchies might overlook, leading to systematic changes in how expertise was identified and utilized. During the morning briefing, an emergency transmission interrupted the routine operational updates. Base Control, this is Patrol 9 Charlie. We have enemy contact at grid reference 4162-3847. Heavy resistance and we're taking casualties. Request immediate support. The voice belonged to Sergeant Anderson, whose patrol had been conducting reconnaissance in Sector 12. Danielle immediately pulled up her tactical analysis of the area, overlaying current intelligence with terrain features and historical patterns that might affect extraction possibilities. Sir, 9 Charlie is in terrain that offers limited conventional extraction routes, but there are alternatives that enemy forces won't anticipate. Harper's response reflected the complete transformation in how her capabilities were perceived and utilized. Jones, you have operational authority for tactical coordination. Guide them through whatever route offers the best chance of survival. His authorization represented trust that had been earned through proven performance under pressure. As she keyed the radio to begin tactical coordination, Danielle reflected on the journey that had brought her from overlooked communications specialist to tactical intelligence coordinator whose expertise was actively sought and utilized. The path had required months of unauthorized preparation, career-threatening risk-taking, and persistent determination to prove capabilities that others couldn't see. 9 Charlie, this is Base Control. I'm going to guide you through an extraction route that uses terrain features not documented in standard tactical databases. Trust my directions completely, and I'll bring you home safely. The familiar weight of absolute responsibility settled on her shoulders, but this time it was accompanied by institutional support, official authorization, and the confidence that came from having proven her capabilities when lives depended on their adequacy. Her unauthorized expertise had become authorized authority. Around her, the command staff prepared to support whatever unconventional solution she might provide, their skepticism replaced by trust earned through successful performance. The morning that had begun with routine briefings was transforming into another test of capabilities that extended far beyond traditional role limitations. As 9 Charlie began moving according to her guidance, Danielle smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had refused to accept limitations and had ultimately proven that determination and preparation could overcome institutional assumptions about what was possible. The story that had begun with exclusion and underestimation was continuing with recognition and expanded opportunity. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.